Howdy, everybody. This is Omar, your audio amigo, and welcome to another episode of the Headphone Hoedown. Told you all these were going to become more prevalent. Today, we're going to be looking at a headphone from Sivga, purveyors of fine wooden headphones and IEMs. This is the Luan, a $300 open-backed dynamic driver headphone with Sivga's typical touch for style. Does the sound match the looks, or is the beauty only skin deep here? Well, let's find out. Quick disclaimer, these were sent to me by Sivga themselves for review. I'm not being paid for this review, but because I could go ahead and sell these if I wanted to, I have gone ahead and activated the paid promotion feature here on YouTube. I do these disclaimers because I believe in full transparency when there's potential bias besides my own personal taste at play. Thank you so much to Sivga for sending these out, and thank you to everyone watching for your continued support. The unboxing experience here on the Luan will be familiar to anyone who's owned any of the other Sivga headphones. You open the box and you're greeted by Sivga's classic Calipigian case. This is a leatherette hard case molded to fit the headphones with nice gold and leather hardware. Much like the rest of the Sivga cases, inside you will find the headphones themselves, as well as a nice branded sort of cloth pouch containing the cable, which we'll talk about in a minute, as well as a 1/4-inch adapter and a Velcro tie for said cable. Sivga scores major points for not only including a travel case, but have it be a really nice one that will protect the headphones. Wonderful crush resistance on these, especially with the headphones in there. Even if it is a little bit, shall we say, posterior inspired, the inclusion is still really, really appreciated. Cables. Sivga can do good cables. I used to own, I think it was a Sivga P1 or a P2. I don't remember exactly which one, but it had this really nice cable with wooden hardware on it, so I know that Sivga can do nice cables. Unfortunately, this here is not one of them. This is a cloth-sleeved 2-wire twist that is extremely memory-prone, very stiff, and just difficult to work with overall. On top of that, it's also microphonic, and I just really don't vibe with it. You can see how difficult it is to just sit on the table. It's a shame because the hardware is nice. The amp connector is, Sivga branded with that nice grip point and Sivga's classic spring tension relief. The Y split matches everything else, is quite nice, and the headphone connectors are color-coded both on the connectors, and you also have very clear RNL markings on the connectors themselves with nice knurling to grab. I would change this cable pretty quickly if I was going to daily drive this headphone, just because of the microphonics alone, but also the way it behaves is just really not great in my opinion. So yeah, I would replace this cable pretty quickly, but it does look rather nice. The build and materials quality here on the Luan is pretty good for a headphone of this price. This is a solid spring steel headband. You get wooden cups, you get metal grills here with really nice foam basically everywhere here on the cups. You do have two choices of color. You can get this more blonde styled wood, and the other is a more like dark sort of walnut style wood. You can see the cups swivel both up and down and front to back a pretty good amount, making for a more comfortable fit. These ear pads here are some of the softest, most pliable sort of hybrid pads that I've ever come across for stock ear pads. They rebound really slowly. They're really, really nice. You got L&R printed here on the inside, and there is some ventilation to try to help with heat mitigation, which we'll talk about later. These pads are not standard mount. They're using a twist and lock system. If I can get this to work the other way, there we go. You can see it's a twist and lock system. You can see the angled driver with the acoustic damping foam here on the inside. There's a clear L label here with some screws holding the front baffle in. There's also an arrow telling you which indication is forward. There's the instructions there, open and close. This can make it a pain to find aftermarket pads. However, I was able to very easily find aftermarket or replacement pads on Sivga's AliExpress store for $30 a pair. So it's nice to see they're not only easily available, but they're also relatively affordable. Other brands' replacement pads can go for like $70, $80 almost. The wood grain here is pretty good. I have seen some people get splitting of the wood here along the 3.5 millimeter jacks. Those have always had the wood grain going in this direction, however, so I'm wondering if maybe they milled these cups differently to maybe prevent some of that weakness from coming. Either way, I've only seen it on maybe 2 or 3 headphones, and they've sold a ton of these. adjustment here is a friction fit mechanism. It does tend to stay put pretty well. However, if you're like me and you really want them to be level, you're going to have to play with that a little bit to have it be comfortable and sit to where it looks the same on either side. The headband is another leatherette material with nice Sivga branding on it. Pretty good quality stitching. There's also some soft padding here. It's not as soft as the ear cups themselves, but it's that same like suede material as the inside of the cups here, meaning that it's actually very, very comfortable. I would say, while you can see that they did use some plastic sort of like on the inside of the cups and in some of the other areas, these are mostly leather, metal, and wood where you interact with them. They feel very solid. Wearing them, you get no clunks, rattles, or creaks, which I think is very nice. I have, again, seen some photos of some failures, but from what I've seen, the people that have had the failures have gotten theirs replaced by Sivga with basically no issues. So they'll stand by them if you do have that issue. Go ahead and pull up the specifications for the Luan. Inside, you saw that 50mm driver. It's at an angle with some acoustic treatment for the rear volume. These are extremely easy to drive and happily ran out of basically anything with a headphone jack, so no dongle required. Weight is just under 350 grams, which is less than I was expecting considering all of that wood and metal. The pads, as you saw, have a sort of bowl shape to them, so I measured the widest point of the bowl shape for the sort of ear cup size. The clamp force has crossed my 500-gram threshold, but we'll discuss why that isn't really too much of an issue in just a minute when we talk about comfort. But yeah, overall, in terms of specifications, nothing jumps out in a good or bad way. The Luan is just a fairly typical open-back dynamic driver headphone. As we move into the cool wall segment, I should probably bring up that I have a soft spot for wooden ear cups, wooden designs, or just like wood grain on audio gear in general. I miss the days when all audio gear came with wooden sides or wood grain finishes on it. I genuinely really like the look, and I'm just old school like that. The Luan here kind of scratches that itch. It still looks like a nice modern headphone design, but it has a touch of retro charm to it. I kind of wish these grills were maybe a little bit brighter, like a gold, or it matched the metal here. But I do like the look of the blonde design. I think it's pretty modern. The darker walnut one I think is a bit too dark for you to appreciate the grain here on the wood. But yeah, overall I think I'm going to be putting these in cool. I like the wood. I like the metal. I think it works well overall. I like the Sivga logo on the headband with the cable matching the color. It looks pretty good. So yeah, in cool these will go. Let's see what the Council of Ladies has to say about these. I've really been enjoying their takes on headphones lately, and it looks like all good marks for Sivga here. We have 4 pretties and a single not pretty from the famous lady number 4. And we have the exact same score in terms of comments and compliments, 4-1 with lady number 4, again, the only holdout. Honestly, good work, Sivga. Looking through their thoughts, it seems, yeah, these did pretty well. Some of the ladies are able to sort of guess how comfortable these are at a glance, which I think is kind of cool. Some complaints are about the color of the wood, but I think that's why they have the darker ones available. Overall, as I said, well done, Sivga. I think this is an attractive pair of headphones, and the ladies like them. Comfort. As the thumbnail might have suggested, comfort is this headphone's absolute strongest point. The plushiness of these pads combined with the clamp force makes this just feel like a soft hug against the sides of your head. These pads are just ridiculously comfortable. The padding on the suspension strap might not be super thick, but these are not the heaviest headphones in the world, so it does its job very well if it's adjusted to be comfortable to you. While wearing them, I didn't get any hot spots either on the top of my head or on the sides of my head, and these are some of the most comfortable headphones I have ever worn. The only complaint I had about these is that these ear cups do get quite warm even with these holes, even in warm, especially in warmer weather. Outside of the heat buildup issue inside of these cups, however, I have zero comfort issues with these whatsoever. I think these are incredibly, incredibly comfortable. My wife also really loved these. She gave these the highest possible score of very comfy on the second head test. Even though she is sensitive to clamp force, particularly under her ear where the jaw is, the super soft plush ear pads here were very comfy for her, and the headband adjustment meant that at its smallest setting, she could wear them very, very comfortably. So good for small heads, and these pads are just incredibly, incredibly comfortable. A quick word on source pairing. The Luan does change sound depending on what source you pair it with. As I go ahead and pull up the impedance graph here, there is about a 10 ohm difference between the lowest and highest points on the graph. What that means is if you use the Luan on a source with higher output impedance like an output transformerless tube amp, the Luan will get a bit warmer. The change is not massive, but it is a noticeable change that I think can be kind of nice. If you have an OTL or something else with a higher than normal output impedance, try your Luan on them. You might like the sound. Okay, sound. The Luan makes a pretty good first impression with the way that it does bass. While this is more of a mid-bass centric headphone, the sub-bass still has pretty decent texture to it. Some of the lower frequency bass hits in levels were a little bit softer than I would typically prefer with such an energetic mid-bass, but if you prefer thump and punch over, dynamic rumble, then this bass presentation will be to your liking. That mid-bass focus also means that instruments like bass guitar, kick drums, and the lower registers on pianos and etc. will all come through very prominently here on the Luan. The big kick drum from When the Levee Breaks has all of the energy that it was produced to have. The beat has the echoey, intense sound to it that I'm used to it having, and it resonates in the ears very well. The bass on the Luan, as I said, is definitely boosted. If you prefer a sub-bass focus boost, this might not be to your liking, but it has enough sub-bass that overall I think it's rather nice. The mid bass warmth has bled into the mids a bit, but it's not to the point where I think it destroys the overall presentation. It's just a warm, slightly slower presentation of some mid range tones that, as y'all know, I can really prefer with some genres of music. In Bloom, for example, the vocals are warmed up in what I would say is a nice, grungy way, and the bass and drums have really nice impact. The distortion is still very aggressive, but it's not as sharp as some folks might want. Overall, I would say it's a nice replay just with the emphasis on some lower frequencies. Female vocals, I think, are very interesting. The fundamentals aren't really forward or incisive, but the harmonics add some really nice layering, which we'll talk about in just a second. Miku synthesized vocals in Deco's Stuck Moth, for example. They don't come across as dominant or forward. She sounds roughly in line with the instrumentation and the bass, but the harmonic energy of her vocals really helps to stop the track from sounding lifeless or flat. It's an interesting way of doing vocals. It reminds me a little bit of how some of the egg-shaped hi-fi men's do vocals, but it's not as cleanly executed. Overall, I would say the lower mids are warmed up, and there's a little bit of a recession to some of the instruments in female vocals, but overall, the mid-range, not bad. As I alluded to a moment ago, the reason female vocals don't sound flat is that the upper mids here are quite energetic. I personally didn't find the harmonic content of female vocals to come across as shouty or overly energetic. For example, Cyndi Lauper's intensity in the choruses of Time After Time didn't really cause me to reach for the volume knob. However, that combined with the more recessed nature of the fundamentals did mean that vocals came across a little bit unnatural. Whether or not you like that affectation is up to you. I personally don't mind it as much. I kind of dig it in some tracks. Instrument and percussion harmonics are well controlled, but I did find that there was some spiciness in the upper treble that was more apparent on more hotly mastered tracks or things that are just more intense in that region. Create Machines, for example. The impact of the steel rods and the tail end of the steam hissing can get quite intense here on the Luan. Not the sounds themselves, but like I said, the harmonics start to become a bit of an issue for me after a while. It's not an issue with every track or every genre, and it might not be an issue for you at all, depending on your hearing and the way that you perceive things. But I have to mention it here because it was something that I experienced. Overall, though, the upper mids and treble are pretty well balanced. The Luan isn't what I would call bright, except for that bit of zinginess in the upper treble. But yeah, that's how I think it sounded to me. The warmer leaning tuning of the Luan helps with some lower end detail resolution. The three distinct bass lines in A Shot in the Dark, for example, the guitar, the bass guitar, and the upright bass, they're all very easily separable, with each having its own strings buzzing, echoing, and rumbling separately. Luan didn't have an issue with them sort of masking or covering each other up. I do wish that I did get a little bit more of the lower notes on that big upright bass, however. In my Waltz for Debbie test, the Luan did all right. It did the usual thing that warm tunings do, where it pushed the background conversations forward just a little bit. It did have enough treble energy to put the glassware and barware hits into relief. While this isn't what I would say is the most technical headphone in the world, it resolved what I expected it to, which is all I can really ask. As far as overall like technical performance or resolution goes, compared to the other open back dynamics, I would say that this is behind things like the HD600 or the AR5000, but I think that's more down to the tuning than the driver quality itself. Being an open-backed headphone, the perceived 3D soundstage on the Luan isn't bad, but I don't think it's a standout either. Tracks with solid stereo separation, like Virtual Insanity, are rendered very well here. The hi-hats and the cymbals are very cleanly separated from the piano and the vocals in the other ear. I never got that sense of sort of in-head sound from these, which I think is really all you can ask. The perceived 3D staging in tracks like a Steely Dan's Black Cow I think is pretty decent. I could place the bass guitar, the horns, the percussion really nicely in the space around me, but this won't sort of elevate poorly mastered tracks, and it won't reveal a ton of layering in your more normal mastered tracks, is what I'll say. I would say overall this is about average with other open-backed headphones in terms of perceived 3D soundstage or stereo separation, which isn't bad, but as I said, not really special either. The Sivga Luan then. This is a warm-leaning V-shaped headphone with some brilliance in the upper treble and some energy with female vocal harmonics. It might come across as shouty or a little bit fatiguing to some, but overall, the main thing I came away feeling with the Luan was the comfort and the warmth from that bass and those ear pads. At $300, it is definitely not alone in the open-backed market, and the competition is actually quite fierce right now. So let's go ahead and see how this stacks up against some of the more popular choices on the market. We'll start with what I think is one of the most beloved open-backed headphones, the Hifiman Sundara, currently available for like between 180 and like 240 bucks depending on where you look. Honestly speaking, I think that this is a bit of a mismatch. But I think that switching back and forth between these two highlighted what both of these do differently, but also very well. In terms of comfort, the Luan easily wins. The Sundara isn't an uncomfortable headphone, but the headband just isn't as comfortable. The suspension strap here isn't as well padded, and the ear cups are nowhere near as nice. In terms of sound, the Sundara is a much more neutral signature compared to the Luan. The bass here is tighter, crisper, and more controlled. The mids here are more forward. There's less energy with those female vocal harmonics, and the treble energy is focused in the lower and middle treble as opposed to the upper treble. The Sundara might come across to people as boring, especially if you do prefer a more V-shaped sounding headphone. But the Sundara is also a more technical, more resolving, and in my opinion, a more correct sounding headphone. If you want something more neutral and more technical, go Sundara. If, however, you want something with more bass punchiness, a more comfortable fit, something that's warmer, something that's, in my opinion, better built, go for the Luan instead, especially if you're used to a more bass-heavy sound. Sundara is a planar though, so let's go ahead and take a look at something with a dynamic driver. How about the Sennheiser X Drop HD6XX, priced at $220 or less, depending on whether or not it's on sale. This comparison, I think, is pretty similar to the one with the Sundara. In terms of comfort, the 6XX does clamp your head a bit harder, and the pads on these ear cups are known for wearing in pretty easily with time. But again, I think that the Luan is overall the more comfortable headphone over long periods of time, thanks to these super cushy ear pads and that suspension headband. In terms of sound, again, the Luan is just overall warmer, as well as has that little bit of extra energy in the upper treble and with female vocals. The 6XX is more energetic with instrument harmonics, and overall I think this is the more neutral choice, while this is the more V-shaped choice, especially in the low end with a dynamic mid-bass presentation. In the bass, the Luan did sound a little bit slower to me, and the mids were just a little bit less clean than they are on the HD6XX. But again, some folks are really going to prefer that slower, warmer, more relaxing tonality that the Luan can have, as opposed to the sort of more boring or neutral sound on the HD6XX. So let's bring in something that's a little warmer and a little closer in price. This is the Aune AR5000, priced right at $300 for the standard edition. The AR5000, in my opinion, is also a very comfortable headphone. But I still think that the Luan is just that little bit more comfortable, again, mostly down to how soft these ear pads are. These are also quite soft and cushy, just not as soft and cushy as these are. It is quite close. I could see some people picking these as being more comfortable than these. It's all down to you. These are very close for me. In terms of sound, the AR5000 here comes off as more mid-centric to me than the Luan. This is not as punchy in the bass, but it has that excellent sub-bass rumble and some awesome dynamism to the bass, while still having forward, very clean mids. The AR5000 cannot match the Luan in terms of female vocal harmonics or in the treble overall, but this does have a similar sort of harmonic forward presentation to female vocals. It's just less intense than it can be here on the Luan. The AR5000, at least to me, is a more wide and sharper when it comes to imaging and sort of soundstage compared to the Luan. If you tend to perceive details in the upper treble, you might find that the energy from the Luan really helps bring those detail forward. However, if you perceive detail in the mid range, then the AR5000 will be the more detailed sounding to you, and it will probably be more to your tastes. Finally, however, we have the Focal Elex, priced 500 US dollars. The Elex is a pretty dynamic sounding headphone on the low end. And while the Luan does have more energy down there, the Elex is a higher quality based presentation that feels just crisper and faster as well as cleaner in the low end to me. Like the AR5000, the Elex comes across to me as more mid centric with more forward female vocals and a more subdued, relaxed upper treble. The Elex makes the Luan sound a little bit more V shaped and less refined, sort of comparing these A/B. But again, it's going to be all about your preference. The Elex does sound better to me personally, but the Luan is once again the more comfortable set to wear, and the pads won't wear in as quickly or easily as these. And more importantly, due to the screws here, this suspension strap here is actually replaceable if it wears out, whereas the headband on the Elex and a lot of the other Focal models is a well-known point of failure, and people just cover them up to deal with that. For sound, personally, I would take the dynamic but still neutral Elex. However, if you prefer a more mid-bass forward presentation, something a little bit warmer, the Luan and its extremely comfortable ear pads could be the choice here. All right, so this wrap up is actually going to be pretty easy to do. All of these are essentially neutral or neutral-ish sounding headphones compared to the more warm V-shaped sound that the Luan presents. The Sundara are a little bit airier with better imaging and more forward mids. It's also one of the most technical sets on this table. The 6XX is more traditionally neutral with a more natural sound to vocals and a more relaxed treble presentation. The AR5000 has what is to me the widest soundstage with the most precise imaging. It's also very laid back in the treble and the most mid-sounding set on the table. The Elex is essentially a more dynamic, bassier sounding HD6XX, but none of these present bass the way that the Luan can, particularly in the mid bass. The Luan is also the most energetic with female vocal harmonics, and it has that extra sparkle up in the treble. Those can be pain points for some people. I didn't find them too problematic. Most importantly, however, in my opinion, the Luan is the most comfortable headphone on the table. The AR5000 does come close, but the Luan is just so easy to wear for long periods of time, provided you can deal with the warm cups, which honestly is not that huge of a deal. It just, most headphones get warm with this headband, with this ear cup construction. Comfort is the main thing this has going for it, in addition to that big, boomy mid bass. And that will lead me rather neatly into the Audio Amigo Arbitrary rating scale. The Sivga Luan does a lot of things correctly. It comes with a nice hard case, it's well made, it looks good. More importantly, the comfort is spot on for me. The sound is colored, but not in a way that, in my opinion, outright ruins sound. Best of all, the little issues that I had in the treble is basically fixable with one of the easiest EQ applications, one high shelf sort of cut, and it's completely fixed. No issues after EQ whatsoever. The stock sound, honestly, is not bad, but the comfort is excellent, the build is nice. I think this is a pretty good headphone overall. Taking into account the stock sound, I am going to be putting this headphone in the "but I like this" tier. If the stock sound was maybe just a little bit less recessed in the mid-range and it didn't have that peakiness in the upper treble, and if it was on sale, this could easily get a "you should buy this." Thankfully, EQ is free and sales are a thing regularly. So if this design and sound is interesting for you, I would say go for it. This is a good headphone. All right, time for recommendations. Who should and should not be looking at the Luan here? Well, if you're looking for a neutral headphone without EQ, the Luan just isn't it. It's too colored with its sound to be considered neutral, at least in my opinion. In a similar way, if you're looking for the most technical or the absolute highest sound quality at $300, I think this isn't it, and you'd be better served by something like the Sundara or the 6XX. However, if what you want is a good looking, stylish, warm leaning V shaped headphone with superb comfort, I think that this can be a great pickup. Also, if you want a sort of open back headphone for office work that you can wear for hours and hours and hours at a time with no discomfort and still be able to hear things around you, I think that this will work pretty nicely. Finally, if you're willing to use EQ or if you're already using EQ and you want an open back dynamic that doesn't really take too much work to get good and is super comfortable, I think that this is a great candidate for something that you pick up, slap an EQ on it, and just wear it all the time. Especially again if you can score one of these on sale. And that's going to do it for the Sivga Luan, a good looking headphone in a good package with honestly pretty good sound that you can make even better with just a little bit of light EQ. Pretty good contender, in my opinion, for the price. Coming up next, I know I said I was going to do the HE600, but then this got in the way. I just got in another headphone that's going to sort of jump the line there. We're going to take a look at the Meze 99 Classic V2. Uh, don't worry, it's quite different from the original, and in my opinion, in all the right ways. It's a pretty good upgrade, in my opinion. However, for now, I just want to say thank you very, very much for watching. Huge shout out to the Compadres Club members. Remember, $5 a month, and you get to decide what I review with your money. You help make the channel more independent and less reliant on samples and tours, which I really appreciate, and you get sort of to decide the direction of the channel. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. This has been Omar with Audio Amigo Reviews, and I will catch y'all next time.